Hello, welcome to the Hawthorn Cottage Craft podcast. This is Coffee with Kate, a new segment to the podcast that will happen every so often when just something to chat to you about that will not be part of the main podcast. I am Kate. You can find me on Instagram as Kate_Hawthorn Cottage Craft, on Ravelry as a runner bean, and there's a Ravelry group for the podcast called the Hawthorn Cottage Craft Podcast. There's also a Ko-fi account for the podcast to help support prizes and postage for knit-alongs. So if you're interested in that, all the links for everything will be down in the description box below. You're very welcome here if it is your first time visiting the podcast. As I said, this is not going to be a regular podcast episode. It's a little mini episode. If you want to see a normal podcast episode, there are 40 something, I think, there that you can look into. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you very, very much for coming back. It is lovely to see you again and to spend some time with you. As I said, this is Coffee with Kate, so I hope you have a cuppa with you. It's just a little chat, some little coffee break where we can discuss different things. Today I'm actually going to discuss, and I'll put the coffee down, I'm going to discuss knitting needles with you. In the last episode I had mentioned knitting needles that I use and that I like, and I'd said that I would talk a little bit more depth about the needles that I have, and I have quite a few, and a lot of you seemed interested in hearing about those. So really it goes back to when I got back into knitting again. I got really into knitting, I think about 13, 14 years ago, when the kids were small. I had learned to knit as a kid and had used the needles that my mum had used, and they were the long straight metal needles, and they put me off knitting because I know a lot of people still like them, and if you love them, that's great. I personally didn't. I found them squeaky and just awkward. And when I wanted to get back into knitting again, I had been on holiday with my family. At that point, when the kids were small, we used to go over to Scotland for our summer holidays, and we stayed in a little place called Rosneath, which I love. And near Rosneath there's a village called Gerlachhead, where there was a craft shop, and I went in there ready to get going with knitting again, and the lady there advised me, or showed me, because I was used to straight needles, showed me to the straight needles that she had, and they were bamboo, and these were the needles that got me back into knitting. I really, really enjoyed the bamboo, but the reason that I didn't stick with them for very long is because I find straight needles quite awkward. I am a thrower when I knit, and I tend to, when I am knitting and throw, I lift my hand off the needle completely just for a millisecond, but it makes it uncomfortable when I'm knitting with straight needles, and I just find them awkward and cumbersome. So I began knitting with these, and when I was talking to the lady who owned the craft shop, we were talking, and she mentioned such a thing as a circular needle, and I had heard of circular needles, but to me they were magical things that I would never know how to use, and I suppose I never thought that I could knit straight on circular needles. To me it was circular needles were what they said in the tin, you knit round and round and round. But she put me off that idea and told me that circular needles were the way to go. So her advice was, because I liked wooden needles, and her favourite needles were the Knitpro Symphonies, she talked about needle sets, and the needle sets that she discussed just sounded so expensive to me, and to buy a full set of symphony circular needles really was too daunting at that point. And it was also a point where I was only returning to knitting, and I wasn't sure if it would be a passing fad like many of the other crafts that I have dipped my toe into, where I've been really into them and buying things for them, and then finding out that maybe as long as a year or two I'd be really into them, and then they would dwindle and the equipment sat gathering dust. So I didn't really want to invest too much money in a set. So she told me about just being able to buy the tips. So my first set of circular needles were the Knitpro Symphonies, and they again are a wooden needle. And I'm sure a lot of you know this already. You get the cables and you screw on your tips. And they have a little key like this. These are the Knitpro needles, have a little key to tighten them. So I built up a collection of these as and when I could, and I loved the Knitpro Symphonies because at the time I was mainly knitting with superwash yarn. So these are quite slippy. They work well for the superwash. And as I said, I loved them. But I also found that when I started to use the woolier wools and the wools that I tend to knit garments with, they catch a little bit and they didn't flow very well. Again, the way I knit, I'm constantly pushing the stitches up the needle, and I found that I couldn't do that as easily with these when I was using the woolier wool. So although I had built up a little collection of these, and it took quite a while, I used these for a long time. I would say I used these for 2 or 3 years before I moved on to a different set of needles. And at that point I knew that knitting was becoming more of a lifestyle and something that was never going to go away. So I did decide to invest in some sets, and I really like the Knitpro. Most of my needles are Knitpro, and I really enjoy working with Knitpro needles. So the next set of needles I think that came to me were my Knitpro Zings, and the set comes in a case like this. And again, I like the sets of Interchangeable was the word I was looking for, the Interchangeable needles, because if I'm working on something I can just change the tips if I need to change the size of needle without having to move stitches onto different needles, cables. So the sets came with the cables, the tips, a key just like this, and little stoppers like plastic like this that you can add on if you're taking tips off and leaving the cables on but not working with them. So you screw these onto your cable to hold your stitches. So I moved on to these, and I really like the Knitpro Zings, and I still use the Knitpro Zings. I've been using them on a recent project. They are definitely one of my favourite sets of needles. I also got the DPNs in the Zings, and I did get the longer set because initially when I was knitting sleeves, I used these for sleeves, but I don't use these very often. They're I'm not sure what length they are. This is the normal set that I would use for socks and things like that, slightly longer. I don't like these because they catch on sleeves when I'm knitting. I find them cumbersome. So I don't use those particularly much. I use these quite a lot. I like when I'm sock knitting, going between DPNs or magic loop, depends what mood I'm in. but I love my Zing Interchangeable. They slide, the connections are very good between cable and needle. There's no jog where the wool is catching. So I really enjoy these. They are slippy enough. There's enough grip, but they're slippy enough for woolly wool. I also did eventually get the carbons in the Knitpro. These, the tips are steel, and then there's a carbon shaft on the needle, which is good for slippy wool and that they won't come off. There is grip. I am using them, and I do use them, and I think I had them on a project, but I've found that they do catch, the connections aren't quite as good between the needle and the cable, and I find they do catch the stitches sometimes, and I find that it's just annoying. It's an irritating thing. It's not that you can't knit with them, but it's irritating when the wool's constantly catching on the join. So of my Knitpros, these would be my least favourite. I like all the rest, either for whatever project. To me, you pick, the needle is dependent on the project you're knitting. If it's a slippy wool, then use something that has a wee bit more catch so that they don't slip off. I find superwash tends to slip very easily off metal needles, so I use my wooden needles for that, and I use my metal needles for the woolly wool. So these would be my least favourite, the Knitpro carbons. Those are my Knitpro needles. I also, as I said, I do like needles, and this has been collected over a long period of time, and I should have said at the start, none of this is sponsored. These are needles that I've bought myself, or that have been bought to me as a gift by my family, and I've one set that was a gift from someone else, but I'm not sponsored by any of the needle companies. The set that I got quite early on in my metal needles were the Haya Sharps, and they come in this lovely little case, and all the tips, and there's the cables. They screw on, but don't have a key. There's like a little rubber piece that you just use to, if I can find it, to tighten the needles. I can't find it, must be in the other case. But this is the Knitpro, the Haya Sharps. And they are just a metal needle. They are lovely needles, but they're not the needles for me usually. These needles cause me much injury. Anytime I have used these needles, I have punched holes in my fingers. As I said, I'm a thrower when I knit, and I also, when I am knitting, push my stitches and knitting down with my finger like this, and this finger in particular has had many injuries with Knitpro. I keep calling them Knitpro, my Haya Sharps. They are lovely needles, and a lot of people really enjoy them. If you've been watching the podcast, last year I completed finally a cardigan that I had started, the Kate cardigan, that took an awful long time to knit, and part of the problem was I was using these, and it was a tight gauge, and I found that with my style of knitting, the tight gauge, I just found it quite painful to knit. So I had been using these, and because of that I had put the project aside. But for Christmas last year, 2019, my family bought me more Hayas, but they bought me the blunter, I think they're called steels just, and these do not have a sharp point at the end, so they suit my style of knitting. And I was able to, because they're the same make, I was able to change out the needles that I was using on the Kate, and I flew through the rest of it simply because of the different needle. A needle can make or break a project when you're knitting it. So I've really enjoyed these. I got the set. I also got the shorter tips for these, which means that I can actually knit in the round for sleeves much more easily, because I can put the short cable on and the short tip, and it means I can knit in the round rather than doing magic loop. So these, I would say, are becoming, they're definitely in the top 3 of my knitting needles sets. I really enjoy these needles. They are slick, they work well for my style of knitting and for the wool that I like to use. And I would highly recommend, if you push your knitting down, that you go for the steel blunter edge rather than the sharps. They suit me. The other set of steel needles I have, interchangeables, were given to me by a friend, and they are lovely needles. It's the Addy Clicks, and they actually were, it was when I worked in a yarn shop. Someone had actually taken some of the tips out and taken them away, and I was given just the rest of the set, and I finished it off myself just with the individual tips. Now this is a beautiful set of needles, and I have Addy, a couple of Addy fixed needles, just random fixed ones, and I really like working with the Addy. They are slick to knit on, very smooth. I don't work well with the clicks though. The clicks, the way they attach, they literally just click and twist, so you don't screw them in or tighten them. You push them in to a groove and click them, and they're meant to lock. Again, the reason I don't use these very often is because of my style of knitting. When I'm knitting, I don't realise I'm doing it, but I must twist my needle constantly, and I have found on more than one occasion stitches that are just hanging because this has detached from the cable, and I've had to frantically try and get it attached without losing my stitches. So just with my style of knitting, the Addy Clicks don't suit me particularly well. They're handy to have as a spare set of needles if I ever run out, which isn't likely to happen, but they certainly wouldn't be a needle that I would automatically go to. They are it's a beautiful set, and if that's not something that is a bother for you, that you don't twist, then the Addy Clicks would be a great set of needles. They're just not my cup of tea. And I have one more set. You'll be glad to hear there's only one more set. And these would be, again, in the top 3 sets of needles that I have. And it's a much talked about Leica needle. I'm never sure how to pronounce that. But it's the Leica needles. They are, again, a wooden needle. They are made from driftwood, and they are very beautiful, aesthetically beautiful to look at. They feel good to work with. And I would say, compared to the Symphonies, they would be slightly more slick. I have used these with a woollier wool knit. I actually knit this jumper, and this is woolly mammoth fibres, so this is a very natural yarn, and I knit it with the Leica needles, and they work in exactly the same way as the Knitpro. And there's something in the back of my head telling me that I have heard that Knitpro make these, possibly. You certainly can interchange the cables, the Knitpro cables, with these. So the set of these was very good. Now, at the beginning, I had an issue when I was screwing them in, that for me, some of the cables were difficult to screw in. It was almost as if they didn't fit. But over time that has improved, and I know other people had found that with their initial sets, and the company were actually very good. They sent them back and the company replaced them for them. I didn't bother doing that, and I haven't found any problem with them lately. But these are the Leica needles, and I really do like these needles and use them a lot. They'd be one of my most used sets. So really, of all my needles, these would be, for me, the top three. The Knitpro Zings, the highest steels, and the Leica needles are certainly my favourite. I have a few random needles from these makes. I also have a couple of fixed circular Chiagoos, which are lovely. I have used them in different projects. They're an expensive needle to buy a set of, and I've always been put off by the price a little. And also I don't like them for magic loop because the cable is quite rigid in the Chiagoo needle, and I find that it creates a ladder for me if I'm knitting in the round on magic loop with them. I don't mind knitting straight. But those are my sets of needles, and as I said, those would be my top three. I link all the needles in the description box below, and one place that I know that you can get them. But it's worth doing a little bit of research yourself. If you're not sure whether you want to invest in a set of needles, they all come individually as well, where you can build your set over time and to maybe buy one needle and try it out, and see what you think of it and whether you like the feel of it or not before you buy a set. So that's really all I want to talk about today. If you have any questions about any of the needles that I've talked about, or any other things that you'd like to talk about when we're having our coffee time together, put it in the down bar or in the comments below, and we'll see what we can do, and I'll try and answer any questions that you have. But until the next time, enjoy your break, and I'll talk to you soon.